Hello, and a warm welcome to the launch of this year's edition of Revenue Statistics in Asian and Pacific Economies. I'm Alexander Pick, an economist at the OECD Development Center, and on behalf of the OECD, I'd like to thank all our panelists and all our attendees here today very much indeed for joining us. Over the next hour, we will hear from each of the organizations responsible for this report, and I hope have time for questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions at any point during the event and specify if there's someone you'd like to talk to or anyone you'd like to respond to your specific question rather. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be able to watch and will be available to watch after the event. Now, because we have only an hour, I'm going to be very brief in saying a few introductory remarks for this meeting, but I would just like to give some background to let you know that this is the 7th edition of Revenue Statistics in Asian and Pacific Economies. It's been in production since 2013, and each year has covered a large growing number of countries. So this year there are 21 countries, up from 17 in 2019, and there are only 7 countries in 2017, which is a great increase over this period. This year we have Bhutan, People's Republic of China, Mongolia and Nauru included for the first time in the report. And the data goes back to at least 2000 in most of these economies and thus provides an invaluable source of information regarding the evolution of public finances in the region over this period. I'd like to take this opportunity to emphasize that this is an exemplary collaboration between a number of organizations around the region and beyond. The Asian Development Bank, the Pacific Islands Tax Administrators Association, the Pacific Community, and the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration, as well as the OECD Development Center, are all working constantly across the year on this initiative, and it's one of the it's a wonderful project to be part of. I'd also like to thank, before we start, the development partners who support and make this initiative possible. These are the governments of Ireland, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. I'd finally also like to thank very much the officials from all the countries who participate in the initiative, who are working behind the scenes with our teams to assist us with the classification and the finding of the appropriate data. Now, as we know, this is not, these are far from ordinary times. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to get together in a moment of, well, very severe challenges. And we should try our very best to make the most of this, a unique opportunity to discuss the state of tax policy in the region in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, as well as other challenges that we confront today. The report we are launching today is based largely on data for 2018, which is obviously before the COVID-19 crisis struck. But nonetheless, the crisis is front and center in this report through the special feature, which we'll be discussing later in the event. The data and the indicators covered in this report also shine a light on the strengths and the vulnerabilities of tax systems in the region, and indeed progress in reforms in this area prior to the crisis. It therefore provides a harmonized baseline for measuring the impact of COVID-19 on public finance. And it explains, moreover, how tax systems are a critical component for the response to the crisis, even in a context where revenues are falling. This information, we hope, will be the basis for both short-term responses and long-term reforms to tax systems in the region. I would like to urge the 100 or so people who are gathered today to ask questions to the experts. This is a unique opportunity to have these people around the table, and even if it's only for an hour, I hope you will get the very best out of us. And please feel free to, as I say, submit questions to particular people if you'd like. And let us just remember that tax policy is going to be a key pillar of the region, both today and into the future. And it's great that we have this opportunity to discuss and even shape that future. On that note, it's my great honor to invite Bruno Carrasco, Chief of Governance Thematic Group at the Asian Development Bank, to provide some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Distinguished participants and guests, a very pleasant day to all. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this event, marking the launching of the revenue statistics in Asian and Pacific economies. First of all, we greatly appreciate all of your efforts involved in the preparation of the 2020 edition, and to the organizers for arranging this event despite the challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I clearly remember the great success of the launch event for the last edition, held in Manila last year. I'm also pleased to see that we have come together once again virtually and convened policymakers, development practitioners, and experts from across the region and beyond. This is remarkable and a show of strength and resilience, reflecting on the extraordinary ability of humans to adapt to change. In today's remarks, I would like to present 3 messages and make 1 announcement. So my first message is about the importance of statistics. Statistics, of course, are incredibly important for accounting, analysis, and to support evidence-based facts, given their persuasive power. I would like to remind everyone of the age-old adage, quote, "If you can't measure it, you can't improve it," end quote. In this context, I am very pleased to see the expansion of coverage in the 2020 edition that incorporates 4 new countries, including Bhutan, People's Republic of China, Mongolia, and Nauru. So we now total 21 developing countries in Asia. My second message is about COVID-19, the pandemic. We are, of course, facing unprecedented crisis, and no country in Asia and Pacific is immune from the impact of the pandemic. ADB's research department produces the Asian Development Outlook, and the supplement published last June shows that all of Asia's developing member countries, which include all of Asia minus Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, have seen downward revisions to growth in 2020. Most of the developing countries, 33 out of 45, are projected to contract this year, and developing Asia is expected to grow marginally by 0.1% in 2020. And this is largely driven on account of the People's Republic of China that we project will grow at about 1.8% this year. As a result, the decline in economic activity, coupled with the various government stimulus measures, fiscal stimulus measures, it is projected to result in significant declines in tax revenues across 2020. Not to mention other important considerations for us, such as increases in unemployment, inequality, and poverty. This brings me to my third and last message, and this is about staying ahead of the curve. So countries have and will face critical challenges during the pandemic crisis, including recovery and post-recovery phases. Policymakers will need to be ahead of the curve and be ready to adapt to a very fluid environment. They will face unprecedented decisions on fiscal policy, including tax matters, in coping with the crisis. They will also have to carefully take stock and assess inflection points on economic activity and the optimal timing to set the stage towards the eventual easing of tax incentives, fiscal restructuring, and eventually support the buildup of their economies. Such decision making, is not easy and should already be in stages of planning, and of course underpinned by a sound evidence-based policy analysis based on a comprehensive, detailed, and harmonized data set as provided in this publication in terms of tax revenues. International good practices provided in the special feature of this publication, as Alexander mentioned, will hopefully shed light on the pathway for a stable and strong bounce back from COVID-19. Indeed, we are confident that this publication will provide will prove to be a good backstop in supporting countries to navigate fiscal policy out of the current choppy waters. In closing, allow me to share an important announcement under our new president, President Massa. And this is that ADB will soon be establishing an effective regional hub on domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation in Asia and the Pacific. The objective will be to further strengthen support to our developing member countries in terms of tax policy and administration across the range of development partners. My colleague, Go, will touch on this later in his presentation. However, I would like to draw your attention to one key feature of the regional hub, and that is its role as a knowledge platform to generate and share knowledge. We envisage under the hub the important role of enhancing statistics to better measure and assess the quality of tax policy and performance of tax administrations in the developing member countries. In this regard, ADB will continue to contribute to the development of this publication as part of our commitment to our clients, to other organizations such as OECD, and ultimately to the regional hub. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And that's very exciting news from your side. And I look forward to hearing more from Go in due course. Before that, it gives me nothing but pleasure to hand over to David Bradbury, the head of tax policy and statistics, the Center of Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD, who's going to run through the key findings on revenue developments in Asian and Pacific economies based on the report that we are launching today. Thank you very much, David.
Well, thanks very much, Alex, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to most of you. It's great to join you for this launch of the 2020 edition of Revenue Statistics in Asian and Pacific Economies. And I have the privilege of taking you through some of the key insights or findings from this year's publication. Before doing so, I just would like to reiterate Alex's comments in relation to the nature of the collaboration across all of the various organisations. This is a report that is jointly produced here at the OECD by the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration and the Development Centre, but we do that in very close cooperation with the ADB, with PETA, and also the Pacific community. And as this slide demonstrates, we have a number of development partners without whose financial support this initiative would not be able to sustain itself. So I want to in particular acknowledge Ireland, Japan, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and also the European Union, who were there in the early days when we were seeking to bring the Pacific economies into the publication. Now, in terms of revenue statistics in Asian and Pacific economies for 2020, we find that this, like all of our revenue statistics publications, involves the presentation of detailed harmonised data on the revenues of national governments. Now, that's critical for cross-country comparison. It is a key tool for policymakers and analysts. And importantly, as Bruno was saying, this is not just about measuring for the sake of measuring, but it's to support reform. And that is all associated with our ongoing efforts through international cooperation and dialogue. And in 2020, as you are all aware by now, we have the record 21 economies covered in the publication. And a special welcome to our new entrants, Bhutan, the People's Republic of China, Mongolia, and Nauru. And we are very, very pleased to have them all on board. As Alex alluded to earlier, even though this data predates the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of the data and the progress on domestic resource mobilisation in the region before the pandemic intervened. And as you will be hearing shortly, there is a special feature co-written by the OECD and the ADB, which discusses the important contributions of tax administrations and tax policymakers in navigating the various phases of the pandemic and the associated economic crisis. Now, in 2018, tax to GDP ratios range from 11.9% in Indonesia at the bottom end of the spectrum, right up to the top end of the spectrum at 35.4% in Nauru. Now, this graph here conveniently shows in different shading the various regional economies. So you have on the one hand there, the dark blue highlights the Pacific economies, while the light blue highlights the Asian economies. And it's interesting if you take, for example, the 20% of GDP point as a point of reference, you can see that most Asian countries had a tax to GDP ratio below that level, with the exception, of course, of Japan, Korea, and Mongolia. I should also note that China's results this year do not include social security contributions. That's something that we're working with our colleagues in China to rectify for future editions. But based on our estimates, perhaps China would also just sneak into that category of being above 20%. When we have a look at Pacific economies, on the other hand, we see that most of them actually have a tax to GDP ratio above this level, in fact, above 23%, with the exceptions of Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and Tokelau. Now, when we have a look across the spectrum of the 21 economies, we see that more than, or just under half of them, in fact, because it's 10 of the 21 economies actually have a tax to GDP ratio above the Latin America and Caribbean average. So from a domestic resource mobilisation perspective, that gives an interesting point of reference. But of course, when we think about the OECD average, right out to the left-hand side there, only on the right of Nauru, at 34.3%, we see very different levels of domestic resource mobilisation. Now, this slide shows that 2/3 of economies increased their tax to GDP ratios between 2017 and 2018. And what this also shows is the impact of different tax types. You could see there that the countries to the left-hand side are the ones that demonstrated or achieved the largest increases. You have Nauru, Tokelau, and Mongolia, Solomon Islands in particular, at the far left. And then we can also see at the other end of the spectrum that there are a small number of countries that have experienced a decline over that period. China, Fiji, Malaysia, Singapore, and Bhutan. But they are relatively small reductions, with Bhutan being the only one above a 1% decline. So I think in the main, we see increases in this period immediately prior to the pandemic. And as I indicated before, that's important in providing that baseline. Now, on this slide, we see that more than half of the economies have increased their tax to GDP ratios if we consider what's been happening over the last decade. So from 2007 through to 2018, we could see the movements in tax to GDP ratios across that period. And of course, the largest decreases have been are those at the far right-hand side. The largest increases, those at the far left-hand side. I think that it's worth noting that most of what has been happening, certainly at the left-hand side, is largely driven by tax policy intervention, so by tax policy initiatives, whereas some of those on the far right-hand side in particular, and I'm thinking in particular here of Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, and Kazakhstan, they have largely been affected by movements in commodity and resource prices. So whilst a lot of the domestic resource mobilisation is gaining impetus as a result of tax policy changes by governments, some of the cases where we have seen reductions in tax to GDP ratios have actually been driven not so much by policy intervention, but by the impact of some of these other price and external factors. Now, on this slide here, we see a little more information about the composition of the tax structure. across the various economies. And the left-hand grouping of economies are those where the main source of revenue is from taxes on goods and services. And they're the grey, light and dark grey lines, VAT being the darker of the two. But you can see there quite a number of countries where taxes on goods and services account for a very significant proportion of the total tax base. Then we see the next group of countries, and they are the group of countries that are more reliant upon income taxes. And we see there some of them are not able to be allocated, but we see that corporate gains in the lighter of the blue and the darker blue being the taxation of individuals, personal income tax and associated capital gains. The one exception that does stand out from these two groups is Japan, where Japan is significantly relies upon social security contributions, which is actually more consistent with the general mix of OECD countries, which is interesting that across even the OECD countries included in this publication, there is a far lower degree of reliance upon social security contributions than perhaps is the case typically throughout the OECD. Now, this particular graph shows where we are able to disentangle the various contributions of the personal income tax and the corporate income tax to the overall contributions of taxes on gains and income. We do see that the corporate income tax contributes more to revenues in Asia, while the personal income tax is a significant contributor in a large number of the Pacific economies. And we can see that by focusing in on the split between the light blue and the darker blue parts of the columns here. And the light blue being the corporate income tax contribution, the darker piece being the personal income tax contribution. And moving to an important area of focus in the report this year, which is the extent to which countries are imposing environmentally related taxes and gaining revenues through that means. And we put some focus on this because we do think that as part of both the recovery, but indeed the longer term restoration of public finances in most countries, aligning those more immediate and medium-term revenue objectives with longer-term policy objectives, such as the need to decarbonise. We see environmentally related taxes as being an important and critical part of the revenue story moving forward. So in using that as a starting point, it's worth just having a look at the extent to which countries in the region are currently imposing these taxes. And we see relatively low levels of environmentally related taxes. You see the OECD average there, the fourth in line. So Nauru, Korea, and Solomon Islands in excess of that. Of course, in the Solomon Islands, that yellow largely relates to resource-based taxes in the logging sector in particular. And we also see heavy contributions to resource taxation in Kazakhstan. An interesting thing to look at is that there are not all that many countries that utilise at least three of the various types of environmentally related taxes that we identify in this graph. So we have transport, energy, pollution, and resource taxes. And when you look at those, there's only 6 countries that collect at least 3 of those types of taxes. So if we have a look, we could see Mongolia, we see Kazakhstan, we see Japan, we also see Korea and China. So across those 6 countries, we see the utilization of at least 3 of these environmentally related tax bases, but we see much less diversification across the other countries. And this graph here gives us a little bit of information for those countries for which the information is available on grants and property income in terms of its contribution to non-tax revenues for Asian and Pacific economies. And so we're looking at things like grants, rents and royalties, other property income, the sale of goods and services, fines, interest and dividends, and other miscellaneous revenue. And you can see there that there is much diversity across this subset of countries. Of course, the extent to which countries do rely upon these non-tax revenues does differ quite significantly from country to country. And that is something worth taking into account as well. So all of that leads us to being able to at least draw some summary conclusions or key findings from the publication this year. Tax to GDP ratios, of course, they vary widely across the region, and that's not surprising. Tax to GDP ratios will reflect countries and economies at different stages of development, with also different aspirations in terms of their needs for public expenditure. But we see 11.9% at the low end from Indonesia through to 35.4% above or 35.4% at the top end from Nauru. We see, as I indicated before, majority of Asian countries below the 20% mark, a majority of Pacific economies above, and in fact you can lift that up to 23% and still that statement holds. 2/3 of the economy increased their tax to GDP ratios between 2017 and 2018. So that's the 1 year point-to-point comparison. We see a whole range of policy measures driving that, but if we were to try and summarize that, we would say one of the biggest drivers was mainly the increasing of VAT and other taxes on goods and services. Of course, tax structures, just as tax to GDP ratios will vary across the region, we would expect tax structures to be diverse as well, and indeed that is the case. Pacific economies rely more on taxes on goods and services, while our Asian counterparts rely either on taxes on income or taxes on goods and services, and as we saw before, Japan is much more reliant on social security contributions than those other bases. The corporate income tax contributes more in general in Asia, while the personal income tax contributes more for Pacific economies. Of course, we should note that there are some Pacific economies there that do rely quite significantly on both of those tax bases. The VAT is particularly important and is an increasing source of revenue in many of the Pacific economies. And as I mentioned before, environmentally related taxes, mainly energy taxes, are used throughout the region, but these levels are still relatively low. And we think that these are taxes that are underutilized, and there is still considerable scope available to boost revenues in the future. And I think that's going to be increasingly important as governments are looking not only to pursue their normal domestic resource mobilisation objectives, but in the context of the post-COVID environment, are looking to boost their revenues and to do that in a way that is consistent with other broader government policy objectives, such as the decarbonisation of our economies. And of course, on the composition of non-tax revenues, this varies considerably across those economies for which we currently have data. But you do see that grants and royalties accounted for the majority of them in 2018. Now, just finally, just to step back for 1 minute and to think a little about the context within which this publication is being launched. The Asian and Pacific Economies revenue statistics is a part of the global revenue statistics project. We have more than 100 jurisdictions now included. You see here in a fairly novel way of presenting tax to GDP ratios across the OECD, Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa. You see the very diverse levels of tax to GDP ratios across those regions. And this is the beauty of this data set, is that it does allow that cross-country comparison. And we have some suggestions there, or some guidance as to how to access the rest of the data. I particularly commend you to use the Compare Your Country tool, which is a very, very useful tool. Of course, just to finalise in saying, statistical publications are wonderful. Some of us could spend a large part of our time immersed in them, but the real value is in being able to use them as a basis for being able to build better tax systems to support better economies and stronger economies. And I think that in the current environment, particularly as we all confront the challenges of the pandemic, it has never been more important than it is today to have good, comparable, credible data upon which we can make those policy judgments. Thanks very much. I hand it back to you, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and thank you for making my job very easy now, because without David has introduced very nicely the key theme of this year's report, which is obviously the impact of COVID-19 on tax policy and administration, or rather the responses of tax policy and administration to COVID-19. This is much more of an active process than a reactive or a passive one. So without any further comment from me, I will hand over the floor to Go Nagata, Public Management Specialist in the Governance Thematic Group at the Asian Development Bank. Thank you very much, Go.
Good morning and afternoon and evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate successful launch of the 2020 edition of Revenue Statistics in Asia and Pacific. ADB is very glad to support this publication, and especially in terms of second chapter of this publication, tax policy and administration response to COVID-19. Based on the contents of the second chapter, I'd like to deliver a short presentation on this matter. So as an introduction of my presentation, let me first talk a bit about the macroeconomic situation in Asia and Pacific. This point was already touched by the Bruno, so I will go very fast. So as the table shows, no country in Asia and the Pacific are immune from the impact from the pandemic. In ADB's Asian Economic Outlook, we have seen several times of downward revision to developing Asia's growth in 2020. The latest Outlook supplement that was published in June showed that most developing Asia are expected to contract this year. Some of the contraction will be large. In general, more opening economies will tend to be hit hard. As you can see in case of Hong Kong, the downward is negative 6% and also in Thailand as well. As Bruno already mentioned, the marginal increase in developing Asia will be led by China's growth by 1.8%. Turning to revenue, the bar graph shows estimation on revenue decline. Revenues are expected to decline across developing member countries, reflecting the combination of economic slowdown and the fiscal stimulus through tax incentives and tax relief measures. Notably, small island economies largely dependent on tourism will be severely affected, such as Fiji, and the scale of revenue decline will be significant, while the government needs to expand its public expenditure to support business and household as a part of economic stimulus. Thus, in general, tax relief measures should be targeted and temporary. Let me now touch on how ADB support our developing member countries in terms of tax policy and administration. In the crisis response phase, ADB is assisting developing Asia to use their tax policy holistically by deferring, lowering, or temporarily waiving taxes to stabilize the economy. Clear communication is increasingly important in particular to make sure that SMEs can have a proper access to those relief measures. Also, a link between crisis response phase and bounce back phase coming next, we have to consider how we can integrate those relief measures to overall midterm fiscal framework. Secondly, given that e-commerce has expanded with mobility restriction across the region in this pandemic era, ADB is promoting VAT systems on digitalized and cross-border transactions in collaboration with OECD. In terms of tax administration, there are three key measures to be addressed. The first one is enterprise risk management, and the second one is good public service, taxpayer services, and the third one is enhancing compliance risk management. In the bounce back phase, ADB will support developing Asian member countries in identifying key considerations related to exit strategy for tax stimulus measures. I'd like to note that there's a sense that in the last financial crisis in 2008, the removal of fiscal stimulus was premature, which resulted in more anemic economic recovery for a longer time toward fiscal reconsolidation. Recognizing this risk, I'd like to note that it is extremely important to choose the appropriate timing of shifting to fiscal consolidation. Also, ADB bear in mind the following some of key issues in supporting our DMCs in developed member countries in tax policy and administration. One is to address the widening income gap due to negative impact of COVID-19 on the economy and society. Under this phase, tax policy should strengthen the income redistribution function to ease the income gap that is derived from, for example, loss of unemployment, increase in unemployment. Also, we need to aware that out of work going to formal to informal. The digital divide was already recognized as driving greater inequality between the haves and the have-nots, which may potentially cause long-standing inequality. We may have to utilize tax policy in order to improve such a inequality in the bounce back phase. The second key issue for tax policy is during the bounce back phase is for support countries' sustainable development effort with broader tax base. Measures need to be considered include rationalizing tax incentives, strengthening property tax policy and administration, and also introducing environmental tax, including green tax and energy tax. Third is to ensure fairness and trust in tax policy. This is important because soon after the COVID-19 pandemic will recede, governments need to restore their fiscal balance by tax increase. Without trust from taxpayers, a government cannot increase the tax burden. To obtain trust, the government has to build a fair tax system. Also, once globalization returns, Asia and the Pacific region will regain the status of the strongest growth engine in the world economy, which will draw in large investment from the world. In light of these considerations, in the bounce back phase, ADB, in collaboration with OECD, will help developing Asian member countries implementing anti-BEPS measures and enhancing their tax transparency with exchange of information on tax matters. For tax administration, digital transformation will perform key role in driving productivity growth and a strong bounce back. In this regard, let me briefly introduce the current sketch of digital deployment of tax administration in Asia and Pacific. In terms of e-service, there is a much potential to enhance For example, for website, content, functionality, and ease of navigation can be a room for there is a room for improvement. And also, relatively few bodies offer a comprehensive set of mobile application for tax filing and e-payment. In terms of emerging digitalization development, there is an early sign of the deployment of some new innovative technologies, such as a chatbot, but not widely utilized. In short, there is a sense that the need for greater investment for digital transformation is recognized in the Asian and Pacific. Let me close my presentation by sharing about our new initiative. ADB now consider establishing an effective regional hub on domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation. The background of this this new initiative is so basically there are several regional tax bodies in Asia and Pacific. For example, PETA and Sugata and CATA partially cover South Asian countries. But compared with other regions, there is no pan-Asian comprehensive knowledge and capacity building regional tax body in Asia and Pacific. So as David mentioned, compared with other regions, the tax GDP ratio in Asia and Pacific is relatively low. So we think that such an absence of comprehensive regional hub will be a gap that result in such a low level of DRM in Asia and Pacific. So building on that, we will aim at establishing a regional hub to strengthen our effort on DRM and international tax cooperation in Asia and Pacific. Under this regional hub, we will aim at organizing a high-level tax conference in collaboration with other developing partners. Also, we will mainstream domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation in our operation to strengthen our intervention to domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation for our DMCs. And as Bruno mentioned, we will also strengthen our effort on knowledge product with focus on enhancing statistics. We are very much looking forward to strengthen our collaboration further from now onward. That's it for me, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Go. I apologize for a slight technical hitch on my end. Thank you for that fascinating presentation. And we would now like to hear we'd be delighted rather to hear the perspectives of our partners in the Pacific, which is easy to say, starting with Koni Ravono from PETA. And then after Koni, we will hear from Niliman Lal and David Abbott from the Pacific community. Koni, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Bula Vinaka, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the work and contributions by our key stakeholders and our development partners in this project, mainly to the OECD Center of Tax Policy and Administration, OECD Development Center, and OECD staff, Asian Development Bank, Pacific Community, SPC, financial support from government that includes Ireland, Japan, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, and the UK. It's my great pleasure to congratulate the OECD on the launch of the 2020 Revenue Statistics in Asian and Pacific Economies publication. And as part of this panel, I'd like to share with you the Pacific's journey of this publication. So in December 2017, the Pacific Islands Tax Administrators Association, PITA, embarked on its revenue statistics publication journey with the OECD. This led to an increase in appreciation of data and interest from members, which had reflected in the increase in number of PITA members to 8 that have participated and contributed towards the 2020 publication. As you all know, that some of the Pacific Island countries and tax administrations have challenges in gathering comparable data across the region, let alone with other regions as well. This publication has enabled the Pacific region and PITA members to appreciate the importance of data gathered and its authenticity in making them comparable with the region and other regions through the publication. So as the head of Secretariat of PITA and representing heads of revenue administrations in the Pacific, it's my responsibility to support our members' ability to contribute and participate in the publication. That will be of value and benefit not only to the tax administrations, but to the government as a whole. Reliable and consistent comparable data will allow our heads of tax administrations to benchmark, learn successes, and propose tax reforms to their respective ministers and government. This will be our third revenue publication in partnership with the OECD, and we would like to sincerely acknowledge the team, Michelle, Hardin, Talita, Emmanuel, Leonie, and the rest of the OECD team for bearing with us as we coordinate, collect, and continuously collaborate with our PITA members to produce accurate, timely, and reliable data for this publication. In addition, we sincerely appreciate the chapter 2 of the publication that touches on the tax policy and administration responses to COVID-19. Certainly this chapter will provide useful information for PITA members as we look for benchmarks, excuse me, and international best practices to address tax policies and the impact of COVID-19. As a secretariat, we had circulated and shared few of our member stimulus packages or revenue measures during the pandemic. Countries that had stimulus package were Cook Islands, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and Vanuatu, to name a few. We had partnered with the OECD to also to a virtual workshop with Qatar, PITA and Qatar member administrations covering Asian and Pacific region on impacts of COVID-19, with discussions on ways to minimize the impact of COVID-19. And no doubt, COVID-19 has reshaped the way we operate, pushing tax administrations to utilize technology further in its bid to collect much needed revenue to fund public goods and services. As a secretariat of the Pacific Tax Administrations, we look to our partners, such as OECD, to assist us with our mandate. We look forward to the continued partnership with OECD on the revenue statistics in Asian and Pacific Economies publication and bringing in more members to participate. So thank you once again for the opportunity, and vinaka wakalevu.
Thank you very much, Connie. And may I pass the floor straight to Nilima and David.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Statistics for Development Division of the Pacific Community, I'd like to congratulate OECD on the release of the revenue statistics for Asian and the Pacific economies. We are happy to note that there have been new members, particularly Nauru from the Pacific. We're also happy to have been part of this collaborative effort. The data in the 2020 edition of the report relates to 2018. Though we're looking forward to 2019, we really wonder what's going to happen in 2020. The impact of the coronavirus pandemic in 2020 is bound to drive down revenue and increase expenditure, which will place a huge challenge on governments with respect to their fiscal policy. So having said that, I now invite SPC's Mr. David Abbott to shed some light on this, keeping Pacific in focus. Thank you.
Anyway, I'm just saying thank you very much to Nalima and Coney for speaking on behalf of the Pacific, and I'd just like to add my my vote of thanks and congratulations to all those who've been party to preparing this this important document. I think it is really encouraging that there are now 8 Pacific Island countries in the data set, and that shows how much importance is being attached in the region to domestic revenue mobilization. Now, I think the figures that have been given to us do indicate that the Pacific is doing pretty well. We have three of our Pacific Island small island states are in the top 4 of tax revenue to GDP ratios. But I think that points on the one side to really good performance, but on the other side, it indicates a degree of vulnerability in the current situation. Our Pacific Island countries all have small economies, limited economic base, and a high reliance on external funding as well as tax revenue. So what we're seeing now is that tax revenue obviously depends on economic activity, and many, indeed most of our Pacific Island economies are dependent on tourism for generating a large part of their revenues, either through consumption taxes or through corporate and income taxes on employment. And what we've seen over the last few months anyway is very significant declines in tourist revenues, clearly because of the lockdowns and the travel restrictions. And indeed, our major tourism market in the Pacific, Fiji, has basically seen a virtual 100% decline in their tourist arrivals over the last 6 months. It's quite dramatic, and this has had an incredible impact on the employment situation in Fiji particularly, but also across many other countries in the region. And what we're expecting to see in the coming months is that income taxes will decline very significantly as there are losses of jobs and part-time working and so on. We're going to see lower corporate taxes as many businesses are closing, or at least on very part-time working. There'll be lower import duties and consumption taxes as people have got less income to spend, and therefore there'll be fewer imports. So we're really very concerned about what's happening in the Pacific economies, and I think we're going to see some really serious issues around budget deficits in the coming months. Indeed, the Fiji government, which announced its 2021 budget last week or a week or so ago, indicating that they will have a 20% of GDP deficit in the coming fiscal year. Now that's pretty amazing, and it's going to be extremely difficult for them to finance such a large deficit. And we're seeing other countries which have in the past generally run small budget surpluses, including places such as Samoa, are also budgeting for deficits next year. Now, many countries in the Pacific are also, as I mentioned previously, reliant on development or budget grants, which in fact, generally speaking, work on average about 25% of their total revenue. So I think already there is a great demand coming from many Pacific governments to development partners, including the ADB, the World Bank, and their bilateral partners for additional grants to cover these likely budget deficits. So we are facing a real challenge in the Pacific, and we here in the Pacific community and the SDD will be keeping a very close eye on the movement of government revenues over the coming months. And it's yeah, I think we're going to see some changes in those percentages of tax to GDP ratios in this current year once the data becomes available. So anyway, once again, thank you very much indeed for all the work that's gone into this publication. And yep, that's a commentary from the Pacific, and we'll keep you posted on future developments. Thank you.
David, thank you very much indeed for that regrettably stark picture, but we will hope for a rapid improvement in the situation in the months to come. This brings me, thank you very much also to Kony and to Nelima for their perspectives. This brings us to the question and answer session. We will have time for just 2 or 3 questions, and I shall go straight into them, perhaps with and they're tricky, I have to warn you. But the first one is, I think, particularly germane given what we've heard from both the ADB and from the Pacific organization. And I would like to ask this, in fact, to each, to representatives from each sub-region, starting with the ADB. So how can Asia build back tax systems that are more resilient in the face of the next crisis? So we've heard about building back fairer and stronger, but it seems like resilience is going to be a key theme going ahead. And I would like to address that question, which comes from Falguni Sundaram Biswal from India. I'd like to address that question to someone from the ADB who would like to answer, as well as to the SPC and Peter. So who would like to field that particularly tricky question about resilient tax systems from the ADB? Bruno, please go ahead.
Okay, so yes, indeed, not so easy questions. I think the first point I would like to make is let us all hope that we don't have a second wave, and that second wave is, if it does materialize, that it's not creating even more of a contraction in the economy. I would say that, first of all, maybe taking to the point on the small Pacific Island economies, but more broadly, so in the context of the pandemic recovery, relief and recovery efforts, the Asian Development Bank has put out very strong upfront budgetary support to support all our member countries. And we've had programs that are as big as $1.5 billion in countries like Indonesia, like Philippines and Thailand. And that is particularly addressing the most immediate needs, whether it's health spending, whether it's safety nets for people, for vulnerable groups, as well as for SMEs. So we're there, and we hope that that support can be effectively used. In terms of focusing a little bit more on the taxation side, for resilience, we're really looking at 2 important elements, and that I would say is broadening that tax base. Across Asia Pacific, we need to do much more. We were talking about raising the revenue, the tax yields in particular. There is still significant scope that keeping at the existing rates, if we do a better job at addressing broadening the tax base, we can get much more out of that. A second point I would like to mention is the whole process of what my colleague was saying, digitalization of tax administrations. We have had some excellent results in a small country. I worked on it for many years, and that's the Maldives. And there they have been able to raise tax yields very strongly on the basis of a strong automation, an e-filing system, and an attempt to diversify, as difficult as it may be in such small island economies that are very narrow in terms of the economic base. So for us, those are two important elements. The introduction of VAT in other countries has also been something that we have looked at very strongly. Again, there is strong resilience in each of these three elements. So maybe let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And a quick show of hands, who from Peter or from the PSC would like to respond? The SPC. That's fine. We can move on to the next question, which actually is for David Bradbury of the OECD. This question is from a journalist in the Philippines who would like to know that whose question runs as thus. Amid the COVID-19 new normal, many Asian countries have been moving to collect taxes from digital transactions. In the case of developing countries like the Philippines, where digital marketplaces flourished during the COVID-19 lockdown, will taxation be a good thing to shore up tax revenues during a recession, or a bad thing, as it may deter digitalization from further flourishing?
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks for an excellent question. This goes to the heart of the international efforts that are currently underway to bring the taxation of the global economy up to date or up to speed with most recent developments in terms of digitalization. The OECD, through the inclusive framework on BEPS, which has more than 130 jurisdictions that are members of that body, have been working over the last few years towards trying to come up with a consensus-based solution to these challenges. Now, we recognize that that process has been going for some time. We are hopefully in the final stages of trying to reach a consensus around new rules to tax the digital economy. But in the current environment, we also recognize that many countries find themselves under the pressure of trying to impose unilateral measures of the sort that the question refers to. From our perspective, obviously, these are questions for sovereign nations to decide upon, but we clearly believe that the best outcome is for countries to commit and to renew their commitment to the multilateral process to secure a consensus-based solution to these issues. And that is something through, there's a two-pillar solution, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, that are focused on addressing these things. We are making progress. We're coming into the final stretch. The problem, of course, with any country wanting to introduce a unilateral measure at this stage is that we have seen that those countries that have done that have been the subject of trade retaliation. And the potential for unilateral action to escalate into trade conflicts is something that nobody wants to see. With the global economy being in its current precarious state, to have a development such as that, the escalation of trade disputes would only do further harm and jeopardize any prospects of a recovery. So I think that whilst it's completely understandable as to why governments are committed to ensuring that there is fairer taxation in this area, we support that. But I think it's also fair to recognise that a multilateral process is the only way that this problem is really going to be addressed. There is one on foot, and we will continue to work hard towards achieving that objective.
Thank you very much, David. And one final question, which I think will go to the back to the ADB for this one. It's from a question from a Deputy Director at the Department of International Taxation of Malaysia, Esther Khoisin, who asks simply this: is introducing a new tax a good idea in the aftermath of COVID-19?
I will ask my colleague Go to attempt to answer this question. Thank you very much. Go, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. To be honest, I don't have a direct answer to Esther's question. But what comes to in my mind is we have to consider after the COVID-19 pandemic two issues. One is the traditional issues, and the other is the new issues. And for traditional issues, as Bruno mentioned, probably we can work on tax incentives and also, from my perspective, property tax strengthen property tax. And for new issues, probably in our region, as a general, maybe we can more work on international tax cooperation issues. Since if we look at the participation in BEPS inclusive framework and EU global forum, there is still room for improvement, and especially in terms of taxation, digital economy, we would suggest to be in line with discussion with OECD. Otherwise, from my perspective, it results in unnecessary double taxation. Yeah, as I first mentioned, probably it's not direct answer to you, but yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Go. And I might actually extend that question to David Bradbury from the OECD as well. Is it a good idea to introduce a new tax post-COVID? Thank you.
So, look, we think that it's important to think about the phases of the crisis. We've been, for many countries, we have been dealing with the emergency response. Now, as we live with the virus, many countries are also trying to stimulate their economies and achieve a recovery. In the long term, there will be a need for governments to think about how to put their public finances back on a more sustainable footing. A significant contributor to that will have to be tax policy. I guess one thing we would say is, let's not jump too quickly into tax increases at a time when what's really crucial is that we get that recovery on track. Once the recovery takes hold and the pandemic has been contained, hopefully through the development of a vaccine, once that has been secured, then we will be much better placed to be able to have that discussion about longer term structural reforms that might be needed in order to ensure that we have sustainable public finances moving forward. But to move too quickly would jeopardize the recovery and potentially also undermine efforts to get the pandemic and the health consequences under control. So I think we need to be very careful. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about these longer term issues, but let's not be too quick to jump to tax increases or tax changes at a time when confidence continues to be rather precarious.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. And that brings us to the end of our question and answer session. I'm sorry it was quite brief, but we've already gone beyond our allotted hour. And thank you very much for all the participants for sticking with us. It is now up to me just to close this meeting, which I will do first by thanking everyone on our panel today. There's a lot of people who you heard from, and there are also a lot of people working behind the scenes and who are also here ready to jump in and to add their emergency advice as and when needed. So thank you very much, everyone who is working behind the scenes to make this seminar happen and who's here today. And a big thank you to all our participants for being here today. And I hope you enjoyed it and found it as enriching an event as I did. I would just to close say that I was very struck by the breadth of the perspectives that we heard from the different organizations. And one thing is very clear: no one is sort of keeping their heads down and hoping this passes and then seeing what happens next. All the organizations are already thinking, looking ahead, and to use Bruno's expression, which I thought was very appropriate, opposite. staying ahead of the curve is going to be absolutely critical in the coming months and perhaps even years, and getting the timing right. And it's an extraordinarily complex work. And what is essential in this will surely be events like this, where we have participants and people from different organizations, different regions, different countries, all learning from each other, all understanding what works and what doesn't. And I hope that this will be far from the last time we convene as a group in the coming in the near future, and that we just keep on learning from each other and communicating. I do have a final thought from David Abbott from the SPC, who's just raised his hand, but I'm not sure if it's if he has anything to add. David, speak
Hi.
now or forever hold your peace.
Alex, can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, I was just going to comment on what David Bradbury had said, but I fully support what he said. And I was just going to point out that in Fiji, in their most recent budget, they have cut taxes quite significantly to try and stimulate the economy. And it's probably not a good time for the Pacific to start introducing new taxes. But sorry, that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, on that note, I think I will bid everyone thank you again, and wish you all an excellent day or afternoon or evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. And yes, I hope we see each other again soon. And don't forget that this video will be available online on the OECD website for the Asia Pacific revenue statistics. And also a final plea, if you're from a country that is, if you're attending and your country is not yet included in this report, please do not hesitate to contact us to find out ways in which you can join this excellent initiative and benefit from the expertise of everyone who is on this panel and indeed beyond. Thank you very much, and stay safe. Goodbye.